Can I request all of you to please settle down? I request all of you to please switch off your phone or put them in silent mode while the conference is on. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We now resume with the diplomatic guest lecture. We have on the dais Ambassador Peter Burleigh and Fredrik Erixon to chair. Over to you, Mr. Erixon.
Thank you very much, and welcome back, everyone, from the lounge. And for the first session we're going to have this afternoon, it's my great pleasure to be chairing this diplomatic guest lecture by Ambassador Peter Burleigh. He has a very long and distinguished career in the US Foreign Service. He's been having different, he's been working in different capacities at the US State Department in Washington, D.C. He's been an ambassador to Sri Lanka and the Maldives and to the United Nations, and twice he was also the acting ambassador here to India. He is going to speak in his personal capacity, so whatever we're going to hear from the podium now is going to be the ambassador's private views, is not going to be the views of the US government. I should also say that, as we spoke before lunch, that we've already had a very rich conversation this morning, which of course may lead to several instances where the ambassador is going to touch upon themes that we've already discussed and provide his views on it. So without much further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Although I have a bone to pick with you, Krishnan, that I would have preferred to be first, so that some of the things I was going to say were already covered this morning. It's the danger of coming midday. Also, I hope you're not too sleepy after that lovely lunch. But let me also reiterate what Eric said, that what you're about to hear are some thoughts of a very retired U.S. diplomat, and not necessarily representing current U.S. policy or even attitudes towards the world. So let me just state a couple of obvious things. First of all, the whole subject and topic of this conference is extremely complex. And the minute we start digging into any particular issue, whether it's country or region specific, whether it's are there universal values, are they really universally accepted, were they ever universally accepted, and if, depending on how you answer that question, how you balance an assessment between values and national interests in terms of what actually motivates foreign policies of various countries, of all countries, I would argue. I'm going to try to briefly review some of the trends that I think are really important in various regions as well as worldwide. And let me start by saying what I'm talking about with regard to universal, what I mean by universal values. In brief, as we heard this morning, roughly for the most of the years following World War II, the victorious parties established a plethora of multinational organizations, which were more or less based on the assumption that there was a core set of values which would both guide interstate relations and establish notional standards of nation-state behavior with regard to their own citizens. We are all familiar with these institutions, such as the United Nations and the Bretton Woods financial institutions. As again was mentioned this morning, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a prime example of the second category, attempting as it does and as it did to impose or at least promote certain standards relating to the rights of citizens around the world and without regard to the type of national political system. Those so-called universal values included in different declarations and multilateral agencies concepts of human rights, political freedoms, democratic structures, election standards, open investment flows, multilateral rulemaking and dispute resolution, humanitarian relief and intervention, as well as development assistance, and more or less free trade, or at least the reduction, if not the renewal, of tariffs and quotas in international trade. Especially in retrospect, but also probably quite apparent at the time, there was never an authentic consensus about such universal rights, nor on the values which underpin them. The vote on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was very interesting, as was also noted this morning. Not only did the Soviet Union and its allies, but also Saudi Arabia and some other important countries abstained on that vote. And I think that was reflective of an unwillingness at that time, and possibly even more currently, to sign on to those standards of human rights that otherwise were considered to be, quote, universal. It's also my view that any serious analysis of any country's foreign policy has to recognize that there has been and will be at least theoretical gaps between widely espoused values and national interests. And I'd like to just draw your attention to this question, which I think is core to any assessment of foreign policy, and certainly of values relating to foreign policy, is what is that balance between the espoused and accepted values and concepts of national interest, broadly defined. It is sometimes the case that values and interests can be aligned, and it seems that is sometimes possible, but more often than not, there is a gap between values and national interests. And sometimes relatively small, those gaps may be, but other times the gap can be yawning and very obvious. It is also sometimes argued that national strategic interests always determine nation-state behavior, and that values are invoked to function as a justification, cloaking interests in a gauze of principles which have at least some amount of international acceptance. We are all familiar with this phenomenon, though it is also the case that sometimes it appears that values do trump interests. I'm thinking, just as one example recent in history, of the acceptance of migrants and refugees in Europe, in particular in Germany, that at least for a while, before the numbers became unsustainable, both politically and possibly economically, the doors were open for such people. But it was an unusual example, really an extreme example when you think about it, of values of human rights trumping what turned out to be national interests, which led the country in a different direction ultimately. If there aren't truly universal values, are there region or country-specific values? Many have cited, and we heard this morning and we'll be hearing more, many have cited Asian values, or more specifically Chinese or Japanese or Indian or other values. Are there African values which are distinctly tied to continent-wide ideologies and beliefs? What about values based on religions and or traditional philosophies? Are there really Muslim, Confucian, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian values which also play a role in shaping foreign policies? This is an extremely complex set of issues which raises many questions which require further analysis. But in short, do they really count in the creation of national foreign policies, or are they more of rhetorical fig leaves which traditional national security goals, where traditional national security goals prevail? We've heard a resounding yes to the question about country-specific and religion-based values this morning, and we're going to be hearing more this afternoon and tomorrow. Such values are often described, and the reason I think it's important for the conference to focus on this, but such values are often described as different from, quote, Western values, more community than individual oriented, less committed to individual rights, more respectful of patriarchy, more focused on stability and social order, or in general, inherited traditions, possibly more accepting of authoritarian political structures. What is important for our purposes as to how these, assuming they exist, how they modify or even contradict the usually accepted international universal values. Another aspect worthy of discussion is whether there is a trend in post-colonial countries to change, modify, or even abandon political ideologies and institutional structures imposed or at least encouraged by the colonizing nations. Some argue that this process is particularly apparent in several African countries where strongmen have effectively taken over, some while maintaining a facade of inherited constitutional democracy, with others abandoning the facades and declaring the triumph of African values linked to a pre-colonial past, whether real or imagined. Another controversy is whether there is an universal and inherent urge to democratic institutions, as contrasted with authoritarian setups, and if so, why we seem to be seeing the growth of national authoritarian governments, even in countries which have had strong democratic traditions. I'm thinking here of important countries such as Turkey, or the Philippines, or Hungary, even Poland. What about Brazil, Zimbabwe, Uganda? And there are major international actors that have never had or ever wanted democratic institutions, at least as they are generally understood. The reason such national non-universal values and political structures are important is that they presumably lead to concepts of national interest and foreign policies which are based on such values and structures. To add further complexity to these questions is the role of nationalism and populism, which seems to be a gathering force in a wide range of otherwise dissimilar countries. Ideologies focused on various renditions of us first seem to be gaining ground in multiple countries, often accompanied by an ethnic/nationalistic dimension, which defines who is and who isn't authentically a part of that particular country. Think of Burma's current travails, or Rwanda's past descent into catastrophe. There are many such examples, though so far, thankfully, less dramatic than those two. Though less dramatic, they are nevertheless changing concepts of accepted values, and in some cases, both foreign and domestic policies. But isn't it the case that us first has always been there within the policies of every country's foreign policy? What may be different now is that that brand of populism seems to have taken a particularly virulent dimension, which often translates into reservations about or outright hostility to immigrants, to those fleeing violence and terror, to asylum seekers, to those looking for better lives for themselves and their children, to free trade, and often to multilateral cooperation in general. We in the US are going through such a phase, in my view, as you have no doubt observed. Long-established democracies are having their values severely tested by such populism, coupled with internal challenges triggered by large chunks of their populations feeling left behind and losing control of their own destinies, and even their ability to find work and create a decent environment for their children. I think it's fair to say that recent elections in the US, in Brazil, in Venezuela, possibly the Brexit vote, the elections in Turkey and the Philippines, and several other key states is linked one way or another to such trends in traditional democracies. Another area worthy of discussion is the concept of humanitarian intervention, which had a period of wide acceptance in democratic, mostly Western countries in the 1980s and 1990s, but which has recently received much less focus and discussion. You all know the concept of humanitarian intervention, which is roughly that international intervention into otherwise sovereign states is considered justified to alleviate extreme human rights violations, ethnic cleansing, for example, or other catastrophic internal developments. Such interventions are always controversial since they collide directly with traditional concepts of the sovereign right of nations. Right now, there is something of a test case going on in Venezuela, where a large number of countries have recognized a new government and where several countries, including the US and Venezuela's immediate neighbors, are attempting to supply humanitarian assistance against the opposition of the until recently recognized Maduro government. The result is two parallel governments. One that was elected through the legal processes of Venezuela, and the other one which was also based on a reading of the Constitution of Venezuela. There are two parallel governments, and one of them is getting support from the outside, and both are getting support from the outside, one major support from regional states. Another multilateral institution, the International Criminal Court, has thrown up similar dilemmas, and the functioning has been severely criticized by some governments. Despite some deference paid to state sovereignty, the court has still been challenged over its choices of cases, especially its overwhelming focus on former African rulers. Its effectiveness has been widely questioned, and as has its legitimacy, even when there has been a consensus that there needs to be accountability for leaders' war crimes and other extreme measures, even when they are internal events. Another aspect of contemporary domestic and foreign policies is the impressive and still growing impact of social media. In several countries, such media is more influential and more widely consumed than the traditional print and television media. Social media spreads information and disinformation quickly and without filter. It has proved influential in triggering mass movements. Governments have been slow to recognize and cope with its implications. In that regard, think of the dynamics of the short-lived Arab Spring. The impact of tweets from leaders, the spread of both authentic and fake news, the power it gives to individuals, movements, and now national leaders. For example, such leaders as Mr. Modi here in India and Mr. Trump in the US were far ahead of their political rivals in recognizing the power and impact of such social media. And they saw how they could communicate directly with their publics without filtering through the traditional media. One can argue that the power and impact of social media has outpaced its positive utility, at least insofar as creating a mechanism for the spread of untruth. opening up avenues for manipulation of publics through the unleashing of fake news, and in some cases, creating social, ethnic, religious conflicts which are very difficult to rein in or dispute effectively once they are widespread. Social media technology has also opened the door to manipulation of internal politics by outside actors, governments, and groups. For example, we in the US are currently going through a detailed review and analysis of what our intelligence community has assessed as a major and largely successful Russian effort to influence our 2016 presidential election. While there is nothing new in some governments attempting to influence the domestic processes of others, the degree of the apparent effectiveness in the US and Russia case has been a surprise. It's a 21st century version of an active foreign policy initiative promoted through unconventional social media means, and we have been slow to recognize and defend against it. These disparate issues I've mentioned, these are all some of the deep complexities inherent in the goals of the conference, all of which deserve analysis and understanding. I'm hoping that some of my preliminary thoughts will be useful to the discussions that follow and add some flavor to the discussions we heard this morning and how they may relate to an impact on national strategies and strategic interests in any country's foreign policy. It's a huge undertaking, what you all have put yourself to address these 2 days, and I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for an excellent speech covering many, many different areas. But then again, that's exactly what we're doing also in the realm of this particular project. We have about 20 minutes for discussion, so I'm happy to open the floor straight away for people who would like to comment, ask a questions, perhaps object to something that the ambassador was sharing with us.
Can I say, Eric, that I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about social media and the impact they have both on national policies but also on foreign policies, if any. If you agree that this is now, in my view, it's a very important new dimension that we've been very slow to acknowledge and recognize and to deal with one way or another.
All right.
Thank you.
So let me just say, I think social media is total crap. I think it brings out the worst of humanity. So there we go.
Thank you very much. Just a very quick question. I like the way you put the dichotomy between values and interests and the various possible co-relationships between the two. In light of that, do you agree to the title of this conference, which seems to suggest that interests and ideals are equal to values?
All right, thank you very much. Do you want to respond to that? I'm going to go to you after that.
Sure, I'll respond. I thought the title of the conference was very provocative and interesting in that sense, and I think it's true of the forthcoming book as well. So, in my view, as an analyst, trying to balance what is triggering various foreign policies, you have to constantly be looking at both underlying values as well as try to understand the perception of national interests of that country and how they balance each other out. So I don't see a contradiction. I see them both as part of the overall motivational, the group of motivations that trigger foreign policies.
And Ambassador, can you recall any instances in your own career where sort of your government pursued a policy that was value-driven, but certainly not in the country's interest?
Value-driven, but not in the country's interest. Do you have something in mind? Well, my country, I think, is one of the examples I was alluding to, trying to be diplomatic, that often describes its policies in terms of values and principles, and often those values and principles are there, and they're part of what is motivating the U.S. for sure. But the other thing that is usually not publicly described anyway is the motivation that is triggered by a perception of national interest, whether it's economic, political, it doesn't really matter what it is. So I think there are probably many examples. Reaching back in my own personal history and in some of the audience here, I would say that a good part of the justification for the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, though described in terms of values, was in fact triggered and motivated by our then perception of the U.S. national interest.
All right. Yes, you gentlemen. Over there.
Well, thanks for your presentation. You know, I would say like the examples from the Indian context. We are recently, Dalai Lama's 60th anniversary, there's a conflict. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh not attending Commonwealth in Sri Lanka, that was a clash between values and the interest. Overall, I would say that there's always a constant battle between values and interests in any foreign policy. The balance is certainly tilted in favor of interests as they are not amorphous like values. Nonetheless, values have entered the arena and they are gradually making space for themselves. At times, values are imposed. We've been talking of Western values or Indian values or things like that, rightly or wrongly, to prove that values do matter. India is no exception to this rule. I think we have benefited from the old times, non-alignment movement, punch, shield, and other thing. But then later on, we found to see that it does not matter. So ultimately, you have to strike a balance between values and interests. At times, the values win. At times, the interests win. Overall, at the end of the day, it is the interests. Coming to your specific question on the social media, I would say that I think in the beginning, it was supposed to be best thing in the world, like globalization was good for everybody. But later on, you realize that any concept, any situations, they have their sinister also. The moment you find that the people start misusing in these days of fake news, post-truth and all those things, I think now you find that you see more of the sinister value of the social media because it is easy to excite communal passions or nothing like that, you see, than it otherwise. And smart leaders like Trump and Modi have used the social media, Twitter, to their advantage.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Would you like to comment?
I don't really have a comment. I agree with basically what you said. And I would maybe stretch your point from India to other democratic countries, including the U.S., where there's usually a public expectation that a policy is going to be justified in terms of the values and principles that are widely accepted in the country. And there's often disappointment when that doesn't seem to be the case. And the other point about social media, it's not just it's just not WhatsApp and Twitter and so on, but also our round-the-clock media. You're famous for it here in India now. We have it, of course, too, in the U.S. And I've noticed in the U.S., and to some extent since I've been here the last few days, that media, too, can have an impact on the public perceptions of foreign policies and what putting pressures on the government, with or without good information and solid background, that the governments have to take, because they're democratic governments, they do take them into account, and it can be very damaging, I think, in the end. What we call the talking heads, you have lots of them here, and we have lots, even more, I think. But the idea there is that it's raw, direct, unmediated, and may or may not be based on facts. But it gets widely disseminated, and if you try to catch up with that, if a government tries to catch up, or an opposition of some sort, or a neighboring country, for example, tries to catch up with that information, it's always a loss for the others. The challenge is framed by these either by television or the social media, and then anything that comes after it is catching up, basically, and catching up hardly ever works, in my perception, anyway.
Right. Krishnan?
Just a comment, Peter, I think is a very interesting lecture indeed. I think that the influence on foreign policy of the media, not only social media, but conventional media as we understand it today, predates the social media very considerably. I'm thinking of the Vietnam War, for example,
yes,
when there was no social media, but there was just television,
yeah,
and the print media, and this created enormous anti-Nixon, establishment feeling. But I'd want to ask three very quick questions. One is, in the last century, or in the last 100 years, have the Americans ever had a president who has divorced ideals and interests so ruthlessly as President Trump? The second question is, do you think this is the end of humanitarian interventions, considering the abysmal record in terms of the interest that these interventions were supposed to pursue? And thirdly, the rise of populist governments, which you describe pretty well all over the world, isn't that due, as some people think, to neoliberal economic policies which have augmented economic disparities?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think to go to number 3 first, yes, is the short answer, that the policies that have been pursued by many countries, including my own, have, without any intention, have created a substantial part of a population which does not have the skills and education to compete, to get jobs and compete in the contemporary economic sphere in the country. And those are people who, in our case, were largely in manufacturing jobs, which now have basically gone to other countries. And so it's not a big stretch of the imagination to understand how resentful such people feel and how they assert themselves politically to promises of, we're going to bring back all your jobs, we're going to bring back all these things. All these other countries have been ripping us off for decades. I'm going to put a stop to that. This was a major theme in our election in 2016, and probably will be again in 2020, I would guess. So that's that. The second question was, the first question was about Mr. Trump, and I can only say, in my recollection, we've never had a president that seems to firmly believe and say publicly that he is only interested in bargains that benefit the U.S. So his campaign theme was "Make America Great Again." His followers all chant that kind of thing at rallies, political rallies, and so on. But he seems to actually believe that, for example, a multilateral approach to most problems is not the wisest one, that if a U.S. interest is involved, we go for it. And if you can manage a bilateral agreement, it's better than a multilateral agreement because there's more, presumably because there's more control. He may think there's more control and more U.S. ability to manage that situation as time goes on. My answer to that is certainly not in anybody's lifetime here have we had such a public statement about national interests and how to pursue them. And I've forgotten now the second question. Oh, yes. Well, I was one of our ambassadors at the UN when Kosovo was being debated. And I can assure you, even then, so this is 1998, 99 maybe. Even then, there was no consensus in the Security Council anyway, and certainly not among the permanent five about what to do. So in the end, as you know, NATO took action outside of the Security Council and the UN structures. That was perhaps the most dramatic, but there have been several others. I incline to think that its days are numbered, and it would, first of all, it really won't work unless there's a consensus among the 5 permanent members. Whatever one thinks about the UN and the Security Council as it's functioning now, if those 5 don't agree on some initiative or policy, it basically won't happen, through the UN mechanism anyway. And one can argue about reform of the UN and so on, which is largely justified, I think, but the current situation, and as it has been since 1948, is that those 5 basically have to agree. And the 5 never agreed on the concept even of humanitarian intervention. That is essentially a Western European and North American concept, I believe. You're looking at
I think the Security Council has actually. It's accepted rather reluctantly, partly because India was on it, the principle of responsibility.
To protect, yeah, sure.
Right.
But I would argue, even though that was the case, that any particular implementation of the responsibility to protect would be highly controversial and probably wouldn't pass the Security Council.
All right, let's take the remaining 3 questions in a row, starting with you. No, the gentleman just behind you. Yes.
I wanted to speak about the social media. They're very well-researched reports. If you look at Brookings' report, latest one came out 3-4 months back, democracy is disconnected. It takes note of entire Southeast Asian democracies. Another one, digital deceit. Another one, Omidyar Group has come out with a very detailed analysis of impact of social media on the polity and foreign policy and other all instruments. Now, what are the checks and balances we can bring in? For example, when we talk of voter education, UN Commission on Human Rights has given detailed guidelines for that. Now, if the social media is going to the extent of not distorting the democracy, don't you think it's necessary that we have some checks and balances? And value education and the civic education, citizenship development, all these features should be built into the education itself. And lastly, I would say that, the democracy, the Westminster model of democracy that we have, it demands highest levels of values and integrity from all the 4 pillars of the state. And what do you think should be done about this? Thank you.
Right. And you, please.
Let me just briefly respond to that.
Okay.
I think with regard to checks and balances, in principle, of course, there should be some checks and balances. I think there should be some. But who's to do the check and who's doing the balancing? And who's to decide this thing should be checked or even stopped or somehow modified? This information that is being broadcast, who's to do that? And what authority would that entity have if it's the government and if you're filtering the information that gets to its own public, then you get back to managed news again, even though in this case from the government side. But if you can imagine an independent body that somehow could keep track of all of this information, I mean, I think our big tech companies are having a huge, aside from not wanting to do it, but now they're under a lot of pressure in the US to get hate speech, what we call hate speech, out of social media. So companies like Google and Apple and so on have huge now divisions that are trying to monitor the tens of millions of communications that they receive every minute. So you can imagine what that dilemma is. I don't know the answer to your question, but and certainly public education and all of that is the real antidote to fake news. But that's also a huge challenge.
All right.
Yes.
My question is, vis-a-vis America, it must be difficult for it to be a first nation in the world. And therefore, its president, Trump, is surely a more naked face of America, because he says it as it is, vis-a-vis values in foreign policy, where he is not a politician, he's a businessman. And therefore, the scope and the focus of America changes as time goes by, especially in its foreign policy, because in the Cold War, just during the Cold War, they were quite happy with Wahhabism to be exported all over the world, because they were much more worried about communism. At least people weren't becoming communists. So in that sense of the word, that sort of focus on values being quite short-term and narrow, do you like to just comment on that?
All right, thank you. Two very quick questions I'm going to allow, starting with you, Yiwei.
You have to remember these questions now.
The world is big, Trump is small, so we should talk more important and big issue, not too much Trump. About the value and the interest, it seems to contradict, but it's not as well, because the so-called values is domestic values, shared values, international values. So I think in the international area, I think you should pursue the interest in the shared value, not your value. And even good for you, but you cannot enforce others according to your value. I think that's very important. Even the interest, also the inclusive interest. My interest should be accepted by others, and then also with the international standard. So that's the inclusive interest, inclusive values, sustainable values, and sustainable interests. Otherwise, any interest, just temporarily, is not against the international values. I think that's not contradict in this regard.
All right, thank you.
Well, just thanks, Chair. An elaboration of the principle of responsibility to protect, which just came up, the R2P. Now, you see, the essence of the principle or the value is that should a country be either unable to or unwilling to protect a segment of its population, then the responsibility devolves on the international community, who will execute that responsibility by operating through the United Nations. That is the principle. Now, it does not mean military intervention. The intervention, in essence, ought to come upstream at a higher level, earlier, in the form of assistance, in the form of economic support, so that the contingency does not arise where a military intervention would be necessitated. I just explained that.
All right, thank you very much. Over to you now, Peter, to conclude.
On this question, of course you're right, but the problem is that sometimes those preceding elements are not there. And so suddenly the world can be confronted with a crisis, unanticipated crisis. One can think of the migration out of Africa to Europe, Myanmar, and what's been going on there with the Rohingya Muslim population. Now, some of that has long history and should have been anticipated, and there should have been involvement, presumably, through the international community and the UN, if possible. But if they're not, then the question is, how bad does a situation have to get before there's, this is my view anyway, before there is a justification for an international intervention, even military. And that's highly controversial, whether it ever can be that bad. Some governments take the view that there's no justification, no conceivable justification for intervention, no matter what, as long as it's strictly internal development, not with regard to neighbors or other countries. So that's the dilemma of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect, I think. With regard to interests and yes, I didn't mean to underplay the importance of consensus about values, both internationally and in terms of interaction between nation states and their foreign policies. So sometimes there is a consensus around some values and sometimes not. And the challenge is usually when there isn't a consensus on both sides. There is no consensus that each side has what it describes as its values, but there's no overlap in them. And therefore you have a dispute and or a conflict. Not necessarily a physical contact, but an intellectual one and a political one. With regard to, I would argue with regard to Mr. Trump that his vision of the world, if I took your question to mean you thought he was being more realistic because he's a businessman and more authentic about what really drives the U.S. Than our traditions would lead you to think. I don't agree with you. I think there's a good chunk of both the American population and voting public, but also of our traditions and values that do infuse our foreign policy, at least at its best. And that reducing it all to you give me 10 and I'll give you 9 kind of interaction shortchanges dramatically, I think, the role that governments can play with each other and certainly the historic role that the U.S. has aspired to play with all of its flaws. So I don't. The short answer there is I don't think he fully represents the breadth of American interests, and certainly not of our history and so on.
All right, very good. It's always good to end a session where there is a difference in argument, because that means we're going to have more to talk about in the next 2 days or next 1.5 days that we're going to be here. I think this has been a very, very interesting session, so thank you so much for your lecture and for very good questions and also very good interactions with the questions from you, Ambassador. I hope you'd like to join me in giving the Ambassador a warm applause. Thank you.
And for the moderator. Thank you.